Hi folks, so I'm here to give my meditation of the day, and it's on celebrity culture, and I'm going to give my thoughts on that. It might appear to an alien outsider, an observer, that some things in our society are perhaps strange, perhaps even mad. Our distribution of resources, perhaps. The gross inequalities of our material wealth and our access to these things, but also our inequality of attention. That there are so many who suffer from isolation today, having perhaps no one or few people to talk to share their gifts with, whilst there are few people who actually have vast audiences, a few people with audiences of many millions, yet many millions of people who perhaps have little to no audiences. I was reminded of this oddity in the recently publicised case of the war veteran Major Tom, who after some publicity, he'd been featured on many news articles, many newspapers and websites, and he received over 125,000 birthday cards, an incredible amount. Now, I don't doubt that most of those people were sending them out of good intentions, and they were well meant, and wished to just congratulate him for his enduring and preserving spirit. Yet also, I can't help but feel that there was something odd about the sheer amount of cards and all that attention, given the stark contrast of the potentially vast numbers of people, many elderly people indeed, that don't receive any cards or relatively few. You might well think them as being enduring and persevering in spirit too, though, and equally deserving of receiving cards. But this is indicative of a much wider problem within our society, that too often our focus of energy is concentrated towards a few and not always towards the many, who conversely can suffer from isolation, alienation, and too often a lack of companionship too. We tend to think of inequalities in terms of material wealth, of land distribution perhaps, or financial assets even. But one might assess also the amount of attention that we pay towards different people and how fair that is. Now, I want to give you an example of someone having to make those kind of decisions. Any good parent will naturally want to divide up their time and their energy fairly between all their children. Yet, of course, some may have a tendency to favour some of their children over others. It might be argued that the division of parental attention be guided by the needs of the child, that some children might require less focus and energy than others, for a variety of different reasons. A child, for example, who has significant physical or mental disabilities or learning difficulty might require more time and attention from their parents. But it would still be necessary to be cautious to make sure that the other children also receive sufficient support too. Conversely, it might be tempting to donate more of one's limited time to a child who's really excelling in a certain field, to have someone in the family representing them that is successful at least. Or a parent might feel inclined to support the child that they feel naturally closest to, that they get on best with, that helps them out with the household chores, perhaps rewarding them with some encouragement. Or then again, perhaps sometimes it's the child who gets into trouble too much, who takes up a lot of the parental time. But then again, is that rewarding bad behaviour with the attention seeking? Or is it spending unnecessary extra time to make sure that that child is adequately disciplined? There are indeed many difficult dilemmas for parents in deciding how to distribute their time, their limited time and energy, and the money accordingly. It isn't always such a simple thing to do. It needs a lot of discernment. A simple approach isn't always right, as equally dividing the time up, since different children's needs can vary tremendously. The very young child, for example, will obviously demand and require much more time and attention than an adult grown-up child, who's much more self-sufficient and able to provide for themselves. And so parents, in this decision face many difficult dilemmas in trying to have a balance and make sure all of the children are adequately provided for. But it's something that we all struggle with. We all have difficult issues and face dilemmas in how we divide up our time and what we give our focus and attention towards, considering the needs of the different people within our lives, perhaps our spouse, our parents, our children, our siblings, neighbours, colleagues, even strangers that we might feel called to help, clients even, dividing up our time between business and our family, and deciding how we spend our leisure time too, what medias we consume, what films, books or websites we choose to watch, all different decisions we make and dilemmas that we face. I find myself generally upset sometimes with what I perceive as an idolatry of celebrity culture sometimes. That is an excessive amount of time that is spent on a few people. And yet, almost contradictory of me, I too find myself listening to popular music or watching popular programs or films, ones that are successful, because often there's a reason why they're successful, of course, something profound about their art that resonates with so many people. Personally, I really love George Michael's albums, but I feel I would, whether he was a busker who played to relatively few people and struggled to get an audience sometimes, or whether he had sold to millions. The fact that his songs were moving to me didn't rely on whether he was popular or not. There are many struggling artists whose work that I do equally adore, even though they're not famous and they don't have vast millions. Something doesn't become great art because it's popular. Of course, something can be still profound, alluring, and speak to our soul, even if no one else seems to value it. We still may do. Perhaps because they are not well known. History, though, is full of posthumously discovered artists, those that were never discovered or found fame within their own lifetimes. Thinking here as an example of a singer that I really liked called Eva Cassidy, and she became famous after she died. I believe her parents sent her songs into a radio station, but she had a relative success in her time, gigging in various clubs and pubs to small venues. But to bring joy and inspiration to just a few people in itself is a great success, though. Whether that's through an art form or even education, it might not appear that when compared to a few that sell vast numbers. But it's okay that some are mega successful because that's democracy, isn't it? If millions want to buy someone's book or film or album or whatever piece of artwork or visit their website, then surely we should recognise people's choice to do so. We might not agree with it, sure, but providing it's not slanderous or libelous or prejudicial or incites hatred, then we should respect other people's desires and their choices to view various materials. Although I should add that there is a great debate still to be had on whether something is slanderous, and that would depend on us knowing whether something was truthful or not, and whether that was contested or not. And there might also be a debate to be had on whether something does or doesn't incite hatred. Celebrity as a category, however, is an unrealistic and unnecessary aspiration for us all to aim for. We can't all expect to have vast numbers. We should be content to have a modest aspiration that is potentially much more realistic. For a teacher to inspire a classroom of students even is itself a great success, especially if it's a difficult subject. Sharing a talent that one has worked hard and strived hard towards to achieve with just a few people, that should itself be applauded in whatever capacity that is. We should not compare that success to others, to recognise that the great benefits that there are of it. Indeed, to truly inspire just a few people is indeed of itself a great accomplishment. Do we ever truly get to know who a celebrity is, though? Or do we just see the edited public version, the public appearance, without really knowing if that truly, really reflects them as they really are? This is a really important issue, psychologically also, in our relationships and how we get to know other people. A celebrity is almost like an acquaintance that one will see occasionally, but perhaps not as intimately like a friend or a close companion who one spends time with in person. The revelations a few years ago of the Jimmy Savile affair, when it was discovered or alleged that he had all these sinister secrets of abusing children, really reminded us that we don't always know what someone is really up to. We don't know if their public persona of how they're portrayed really is a true reflection of what they get up to behind closed doors, their private life. And indeed, many people sadly have discovered their own relatives, acquaintances, or even people they considered friends who may have had and hidden a double life away from them. There are no doubt potentially many other celebrities who may have true identities that may not be what they seem to be, whose edited public persona may not reflect their real character. Can we ever really know a celebrity then, if we only ever see an edited version? How do we know anyone? Couldn't anyone be hiding a double life potentially then? I mentioned my own love of George Michael's music earlier. I thought that I knew him though. I never met him. I saw interviews of him talking, of course, and I felt from his demeanour, his tone, and the words he used that he seemed genuine to me when he was talking. But more than that, I felt that the artist was recognisable in the art. As is said in the old saying, "Ye shall know them by their fruits." That is to say, what a man produces or creates is often a reflection or an extension of who he is. Now, some of George Michael's songs were explicit, raunchy, even lustful at times, yet others, his more mature, later music, were much more thought-provoking, melodious, soulful, contemplative even. George Michael, like his music, divided public opinion. Some critics found some of his performances, especially his earlier works, to be a little materialistic, commercial, hedonistic, even over-sexualized sometimes. And certainly he would be disliked by conservative critics. Others found some of his later albums to be too overtly political, perhaps overtly anti-war. I perhaps have some sympathy for those conservative critics of George who found his music too erotic and hedonistic, but I happen to prefer his more mature, soulful music. It was more contemplative in his last few years. His albums Older and Patience in particular. Nevertheless, why I really felt I knew George is that his worst faults were all known. His cottaging for sex, his conviction for lewd conduct, his drug addiction, of drug driving, widely splashed across the tabloids and widely reported. I knew he had his faults, and I wouldn't want to glamorise those. He, like us all, has his flaws. Yet at least he eventually was able to talk openly about them. And I'm glad to say at least he overcame his addictions. But with George Michael, I felt it was better the devil you know. I always like an artist, or anyone indeed, who one knows the flaws of. Perhaps in his case, he wasn't really able to hide his flaws so well, because they were so widely publicised at least. But I found at least in his later interviews there to be an honesty, a bravery, where he was able to talk openly about such embarrassing flaws, about his fears over confronting controversial issues, his sorrows at having lost his partner to an illness. I really felt I got to know different sides of him, the ashamed version of him, and him when he was proud too. George Michael when he was angry, and when he was depressed, and also when he was joyful. Seeing someone bare their soul in a really moving, if difficult, time is a thing that's really hard for any of us to do, actually. Confronting the emotional realities of who we are and talking about difficult issues that we've been through, of when we've harmed others, of when we've embarrassed or shamed ourselves, of when we've been a victim of various things. Difficult things to talk about candidly, transparently, because there's a risk in that. The risk of bearing our soul, of having that honesty, is that people can use that information against us. They know our Achilles heels, they know our weaknesses. Indeed, in his early life, George Michael was not so much like that. You know, in his earlier days, his interviews were much different than his later ones. They were carefully controlled, scripted sometimes, choreographed. Indeed, he was acting much of those times. Indeed, he did have a double life, hiding his sexuality for many years. Maybe even hiding a hedonistic lifestyle too. Well, of course, many of us can have hidden double lives. It's more common than you'd think, because we know a wide variety of different people in our lives. So it's often difficult when you know very conservative and very liberal people to be honest about all the different sides and beliefs that we have in our life. Well, we all can be actors sometimes, putting on a pretense to keep up appearances in public, or in videos that we upload, or blogs that we write, or Facebook updates that we post. It can sometimes be necessary, of course, to act and put on a brave face, a soldiering on face for the kids, perhaps, when we're feeling depressed and don't want to show them that we're so down. But just as there are legitimate times when we need to act, there are also times when we need to be real, to be emotionally real, to show the real us to the world, the confessional us, humbled and apologetic, and the hurt, the sad and depressed us. There are times when it's vital that we speak up and embrace those emotions rather than repressing them all the time. In celebrity, I feel that there's a double-edged sword. I feel that it's difficult because you know that lots of people are aware and know some things about you, but they don't necessarily know everything about you. And that is the idea that lots of people, huge numbers, can know wrong things about you. There can be many people that hate you, either for right or wrong reasons, and maybe many people that love you for the right or wrong reasons. The difficulty for someone that's being celebrated is that there's a huge gap often between who the public persona and the different ideas that people have about us and the actual reality of who we are. And that's all too common, in fact. People that are celebrities often are concerned about protecting their private life. People are concerned about being harassed by paparazzi, about their family also being. And why do we want to have a private life indeed? We all have things that we might feel embarrassed about. We all feel that there are things that might be difficult for us to talk about publicly. Because the public is made up of a diverse group of different people from different political, economic, social, religious, philosophical backgrounds, there are bound to be things in all our lives that will upset different people according to what our lifestyle choices are. So therefore, if everyone was to know everything about us, necessarily it would be bound to upset some people some of the time. Even if it was things that we felt were personally okay, we might justify and think it's fine, but other people may not. And so it might be necessary for all of us to feel that we might want to be guarded and safeguard some of our privacies. But nevertheless, we should still aim and want to talk openly about things in life where we feel it's legitimate and necessary to do so. You know, just as there's a struggle with being celebrated, and there's a struggle in the sense that there's a pressure, there's the burden of responsibility the expectation that many people will have of you to live up to ideals, to be held accountable to what their perceptions and what their values are and what their expectations of you are also. And they may have beliefs about you that either may be true or not. And of course, the concerns about the lack of or diminishing privacy in one's life. All quite interesting and right concerns for anyone who's a celebrity or considered that. But there are also difficult issues in anonymity. Equally, the idea that nobody cares about you or no one takes interest, that you don't have that self-worth, that you don't have that validation. And that's just as much a struggle too. The idea that nobody out there has any kind of care or desire to learn and know about you. So it can be difficult to want to care about yourself if you don't feel that others don't value and care about you too. And so both anonymity and celebrity or fame both have their own difficult issues and hurdles to overcome. They're both difficult things. People that are anonymous often desire to be famous. People that are famous, ironically, often desire the anonymity again. The grass always appears greener. There may be times in all our lives where we may become famous through choice or not for something, and we may have to come to terms with that and deal with it as best that we can. And there may be times where we may have to deal with the situation of being anonymous and to struggle with that as well. And so it is a difficult situation, both anonymity and also fame as well. We don't need to desire fame in and of itself. You know, it isn't something that is necessary for any of us. You know, it's great to be moderately successful. You know, if we only reach out and are able to speak to a few people, then that in itself is a wonderful blessing and a great thing. I think like Mother Teresa said, you know, that if we can be a benefit to just a few people, to help some of the people some of the time, that in and of itself is a wonderful and a great achievement actually. And also, if we can limit the amount that we harm other people too. So with fame comes that, like I said, burden of responsibility. You know, the more rights you have, the more responsibilities you have too. And if you have lots of people that are following you, you know, there is that responsibility for that, because you could influence lots of people to do good or to do bad. And I think we all need to take that cautiously, responsibly. But of course, we all do make mistakes as well sometimes, you know. So those are my general reflections. I don't want to ramble on any more than that. But I think, just to add to it, there was an article I was reading earlier on about David Bowie. Years ago, I got into some of his music. I liked some of his songs. Thought they were really catchy, sing-along tunes, you know. You could sort of dance and sing to. He had a really sort of different, sort of bizarre way of dressing and acting. But then I was reading some articles earlier that seemed to allege that he had a fascination with Nazi paraphernalia and had a real interest in the occult and in Aleister Crowley in particular, who was really notorious for some really awful practices that he was said to engage within. Oh, God knows the extent of it all, really. But, you know, if you're to believe some of the reports, some awful things that potentially he was involved with. And, you know, potentially just terrible things, child sacrifice, potentially, you know, murder, awful things. Now, how much of that he actually did, who knows the extent of it, really. But he certainly wrote books that promoted those sort of things. So there's definitely something awful going on there. And David Bowie actually makes reference to Aleister Crowley in some of his songs. And I, of course, had absolutely no idea when I was listening to his lyrics and singing them even sometimes that there were any kind of references like that. And they're not sort of casual references. They're very specific to celebrating Aleister Crowley, the Golden Dawn. And really it's and so it really does show that he had a fascination with that. And actually there's a lot of occult symbolism within his videos and within his dressage as well. But of course, you know, we don't know the extent of what he did. Did he participate in some awful rituals? Who knows? It's quite possible that he did. Or did he, you know, take an interest in it, using lots of narcotics and drugs, having a mental breakdown and, you know, was getting interested in all sorts of things that were potentially bad, but he may not have acted on any of it, you know. Who knows? You know, it's really hard, isn't it? Sometimes you feel like you feel like you learn something about someone, you know, who you'd celebrated, or you'd listened to their songs and was a part of your life, and then you learn some new information that sort of puts a new spin on things, doesn't it? And makes you think twice. Well, I don't know really with David Bowie whether he was involved in some sort of awful rituals potentially or not, or whether he was just reading about those out of interest. It's hard to know. It may look suspicious, but some things may look suspicious but are not. You know, lots of people find out things about people that they celebrated and then later discover, you know, that their idols are not what they thought they were, you know. And like I said with George Michael, at least with him, I felt it's better the devil you know. I would rather know what someone's flaws were, what their weaknesses, what their bad things were. You know, I can admire and respect someone that is able to confess and talk openly about what their faults, their sins, or their crimes, however you want to phrase it, were. You know, always be careful of someone that appears too good to be true, you know, like a pantomime hero, for example, because we all have flaws. Your life experiences should be the teacher of that, and they've certainly been the teacher to me of that. But I've made lots of mistakes of that when I was much more naive and young, and I probably will continue to sometimes, because, you know, we don't know an artist always from his art, but we should carefully study what the art is for the clues to who the artist is that might reveal more about who they really are, you know, because too often we can sing the lyrics to something, even dancing away to something without really knowing what it means. Well, you know, I was singing along to Bowie's songs sometimes. I even bought one of his albums. I didn't sort of have any kind of knowing or conscious fascination with the occult or any satanic practices or anything like that. And I don't think I was in any way severely affected by it myself, because I wasn't actively or consciously sort of knowingly doing that or celebrating that. Nevertheless, it's sort of good to try and be more mindful, more conscious about the type of art that you consume, about what its intentions are, what are its deeper meanings, you know, how does it connect to different things within culture, what kind of values does it promote. They're important questions to ask about any kind of art, and especially about the art that we ourselves produce. You know, that's always more important to do a self-analysis, you know, to ask ourselves, you know, what are my motivations? What are my inspirations? You know, these are good questions for us all to contemplate, not just to ask other people, celebrities, our friends and other people, but to ask it and be consistent of ourselves too.